It's okay, you can start.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for being here for what I believe is the last installment of our joint seminar series for the autumn semester. And gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce our invited speaker today, Professor Christos Pliatsikas, who's joining us today from, well, in person in Lancaster and virtually for us. For many of us in the room and on this call, Christos needs no introduction, but in case you haven't met him before, know of his work, Christos has been a huge contributor in the field of bilingualism and the neurocognitive adaptations to it for the past going on 15, 16 years at this point. That's culminated recently in a theoretical model he's proposed, which I believe he will talk a bit about today, noting the structural outcomes of bilingual experience and crucially the individual differences in how the trajectory of those outcomes should obtain. But of course, fields progress, and I think today he'll be leading both a talk and a discussion on what's next. Where do we go from here? So we're really looking forward to hearing your insights, Christos. As a general rule, we do ask, we'll try and keep the big questions for the end, but are you comfortable with getting clarification questions during the talk if they arise? I'll take that as a yes. In that case,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, in that case, the floor is yours. We're all looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Vince. Thank you, Jason, Patrick, and Patty, and everybody who invited me here for your last talk of the year. So yes, this is a talk about bilingualism and neuroplasticity. And as Vince mentioned, this is about the work we've been doing for the past 10 years, I would say. But I want this to be also about what we can do next, because I, over and over, find myself repeating the same things, more or less. So the question is, how do we progress the field? So there's a bit of everything. There's an overview of the work we've done. It's not a detailed one because I've talked about these things extensively many times in the recent past. Some new work, some new findings, and for these I invited my own guest. So that's my former student and current postdoc, Alex Sheehan, who will present some newer data from two of his studies we do in Reading. But also there's some ideas of what we can do in the future. So there's a lot of prospective stuff that we haven't done yet. And then I would want your input in these ideas, your feedback. So let's start with the basics. And these are a couple of slides that I've presented several times recently. So this is the study of experience-based neuroplasticity in general and how bilingualism can induce this sort of neuroplasticity. So how bilingual experiences can change the shape of the brain, but also the function of the brain. And in general, we know from other studies in neuroplasticity that brain morphology, the structure of a brain, the shape of a brain is not really static. And many life experiences can cause adaptations in the structure of the brain. And you see these adaptations both in the gray matter of the brain, which is the surface of the brain, plus some structures deep inside the brain. You could say that this is most of the processing, that this is where most of the processing happens in the brain. But also you see these changes in white matter as well, which is the main avenues for connectivity between brain areas. So this is neuroplasticity. This is changes that happen due to experiences, not due to aging or due to disease or due to other things. And also, this experience-based neuroplasticity can happen on top of changes that are due to aging and independent of the developmental milestones as well, right? Because we know that the brain matures and it follows several trajectories of maturation. The structural adaptations are also very usually accompanied by functional adaptations. So we see changes in local activity or connectivity between brain regions, even within the hemisphere or across hemispheres. So the bottom line of the whole study of experience-based neuroplasticity is that cognitively demanding experiences can cause adaptations in those brain regions that are related to the task you're learning and you're becoming an expert in. And we've seen that from other things, people that become expert jugglers or expert athletes or learn how to play musical instruments. They also structural differences in different parts of the brain, which are key to those skills they're learning. So the question has been, what about bilingualism? And this started because of some data about some evidence about 20 years ago started coming out, 2025, showing that bilinguals may have different brain structure and some different volume, some brain structures related to language acquisition. So the question is bilingualism one of those experiences that can change brain structure? Well, we can all agree, at least in this room and online, but also in general, we can agree that being a bilingual is a long-term experience, which encompasses learning demands. You always learn in your language, in your additional language, right? You never, I don't think you reach a point where you say, I know everything about it. But also there's increasing control demands. The more you learn about languages, the more you have to control between, right? So this is an ongoing experience, and it's also a long-term experience. It's not the same as playing chess at your free time. It's not a leisure activity. It's something that's sustained, especially if you find yourselves in environments that force you to use language A or language B and suppress the other one. So both languages are active and compete. We know that very well. And also we know that you become better at the task of both learning the language, but also juggling the languages in the right context, at least. So if that is the case, should it be expected to affect brain structure and function? And if so, where would you find that in the brain, and how would you see that in the brain? So the basic principles of experience-based neuroplasticity tell us that, yes, those experiences do change the structure of the brain, but also that these changes are not linear. So it's not the case that you learn something and this part of the brain that undertakes this something grows forever, becomes huge. And it's not just the case, it's not just because we have a skull and the brain couldn't grow forever. It's because there are other principles that need to be adhered to. So looking at this graph, if you focus at the first two panels at the top. So in the first panel shows how your behavior changes when you learn something. Practically, you become better over time when you learn something. And the second panel shows how gray matter volume changes in the brain while you learn something. And I will focus on gray matter in this talk because we have more evidence and more consistent evidence about the gray matter. So we know that when you start learning something, the gray matter volume of the affected area starts growing as you learn. And as you become better, it grows and grows and grows. But after a certain point, right here, you are an expert, let's say, in this skill. So behavior is up here, right? So your performance is very good. But then you see that over time, this initial growth goes, and then these parts of the brain start shrinking, let's say, again. So why is that? So learning something new requires new connections in the brain. And these new connections are provided by the creation of new dendritic spines. So you have the neurons connecting to other neurons in many ways, in more ways than before, in order to identify which of these new connections, which of the new pathways are the best ones to undertake this task. And that's what causes this initial growth that we see. But this is costly. This consumes energy, and the brain doesn't really like that. The brain is an efficient organ. So once the efficient connections are identified, everything else gets pruned. So you don't need all these new connections. You just need the good ones, let's say. And this is where you see the performance getting better or very good, but then the volume dropping back. Because now you've identified the good routes. So you're good at your task, you know which routes to use, and everything else can really go. So this tells you that the effects are nonlinear. And this helped me understand a lot of variability in the literature at the time, because a lot of people were comparing bilinguals to monolinguals, and some were finding increases some structures for bilinguals versus monolinguals. Some would find the opposite. Some wouldn't find anything. Some would find increases only the white matter. So it was a mess up until 6-7 years ago. But practically copying these principles of experience-based neuroplasticity, I tried to reinterpret the findings that we have on bilingualism. And I came up with what I call the dynamic restructuring model, showing that, yes, there are neuroplastic effects on the bilingual brain, but these effects follow these general principles for neuroplasticity, and that explains the variability in the results. So this is just a schematic representation of this model. And in there, I argue that with increasing experience that you see here, from top to bottom, you should expect different effects. So at an initial exposure, when you first started learning the language intensively, or where you first put in an environment where you have to learn and use the language, you should see increases in volume in several gray matter areas, especially around the cortex. And these tend to be areas related to vocabulary acquisition, phonological acquisition, so more acquisition-y, let's say, areas. But also you see some effects in subcortical areas like the caudate nucleus or the cerebellum, which are the ones that are very critical for cognitive control. Because the moment you start learning extra things, then you have something to control between, right? So as your experience increases, you reach the second stage, which I call the consolidation stage. Go back. And then at that stage, you see that these initial effects actually start disappearing. And this is probably because of this pruning that we talked about, right? So you reach the point, you know how to acquire vocabulary now, you know how to control things. You don't need all this tissue. So let's get rid of this extra tissue. But then you see increases in other areas, particularly subcortical regions of the brain that are very key to control, phonological control, articulatory control, and no other process that you need as an experienced bilingual. And also at this stage, these are all white matter tracts. That's where you're starting to see increases in the white matter tract, which signifies more efficient connectivity between brain regions. The third stage are called peak efficiency, which applies to super experienced bilinguals or language switchers, let's say. And then at this stage, you even start seeing decreases in the effects you found in subcortical structures, but also maybe in white matter as well. But this is the less well-defined stage, simply because we don't have enough samples that have this big amount of experience. And usually this applies to interpreters or these super switchers, super bilinguals. We'll come back to that. So bilingualism is a dynamic experience, and it should be studied as a dynamic experience, right? So we should, especially when it comes to studying the effects of bilingualism on cognition and the brain, we should move away from this simplistic comparison, mono versus bi. We need to look into the individual experiences of the bilinguals. And we know that, especially in earlier studies, definitions of bilingualism varied a lot. So you would have early bilinguals versus late bilinguals, early bilinguals versus monolinguals, late versus monolinguals, blah, blah, blah. So you had all these things, but then you had a label. There wasn't any measurement of the bilingual experience in those initial studies. And then I always have this there because this is a very interesting paper by John and Tiff, that how we should be viewing bilingualism as a systems framework. So it's just a reference for you. So how do you follow up on this idea that the effects of bilingualism on the brain are dynamic and come down to experiences, really? Well, you can test it. We have questionnaires that measure bilingual experience. One of them is the LSBQ, the Language and Society Background Questionnaire. And you can use, so questions like the LSBQ produce a composite score of bilingual experience, which you can use as a predictor of brain structure. So this is what we did in this study with my former student, Michal Korenar. We looked at the brains of 114 highly proficient Czech English bilinguals living in Czechia, so not immersed in a highly bilingual environment, but with a range of experiences. So we measured this experience with LSBQ, and we want to see how the LSBQ predicts the volume of the caudate nucleus. And to do that, so the caudate nucleus, because I mentioned, is a key structure in cognitive control and language control more specifically. And also we used an approach called generalized additive models, which allows you to look for nonlinear effects. So it's not just a regression or a multiple regression that looks for linear effects. This allows you to detect nonlinear effects. So what you see in this graph here, in the bottom, you see the LSBQ score. It's a composite score, so it starts at minus something. It doesn't really matter. So participants down here are functional monolinguals, and participants up here are very experienced bilinguals, right? So that's the scale. And on the y-axis, it's the volume of the coded nucleus. So this line shows you the relationship between bilingual experience and the volume of the coded nucleus. And you will see that with increase in experience, you get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger coded up to a certain point. And then experience increases, but then the volume of the coded plateaus, if not reduces. If that reminds you of something, that was the prediction of my model. So when that came out, we were very, very excited because it made sense. We had the theory for it, and we were able to show this. So very, very excited about that. The other thing that we saw in that paper that was quite interesting, and we'll come back to that later on, we threw age in. So this is a three-dimensional graph. So this line here, you can see, yeah, it's this line again. But now we have this z-axis, which is the age of our participants. So towards the back of this box, you have the young ones, the 20-year-old ones, and towards the front, you have the 50-year-old ones. So we had a wide-ish age range. So what you need to notice here is that these are the 20-year-old monolinguals, and this is the volume of the codec, which seems to be more or less the same level of the volume of the codec in the 50-year-old highly experienced bilinguals. Right, so I'll give you a few seconds to digest this. So these are people back here that are 20-year-old, they've never used the language. For monolinguals, you see the drop in the volume from 20 to 50 down here. And that's what you expect with aging, that the brain shrinks rapidly. So this line is to be expected. But then these are the 50-year-old monolinguals, and these are the 50-year-old bilinguals. So you already see a difference here. I mean, I won't give you stats for it because the samples are not very big in either side, but this is an indication of what we're going to talk about later on, right? And that was another very promising finding. The other exciting thing about the coded nucleus, and some people in the room may be excited about this equally, is that it's an effect that has been replicated, and it has been replicated in different contexts, right? So we had a few of these structures, not just the coded, reported restructuring in similar ways in simultaneous bilinguals living in Valencia, so Catalan Spanish bilinguals, but also in non-numerous bilinguals in Russia, Fede did that study. So we love the coded because A, it proves the theory, and B, it's a robust effect. It's a replicable effect. We also wanted to delve deeper into this finding, and we looked at some chemicals that you find in the brain, and the concentration of these chemicals signify these procedures of pruning that I talked about. So we looked at the cluster in the brain covering the basal ganglia, the coded nucleus, and the putamen, and we looked at the concentrations of myoinositol and N-acetyl aspartate, or NAA, both of which signify these pruning processes. So the more you prune, the more you lose the volume of the coded, the higher the myoinositol and the lower the NAA. So they work the opposite way, right? So we tested that in 99 immersed bilinguals in the UK, and we found that with age, the concentrations of NAA and myoinositol changed between the two groups. So you'll see the concentration of, what's this one? Myoinositol increases in bilinguals over time. And then NAA decreases in bilinguals over time faster than it does for monolinguals. So it's not just aging because people are aging, are of the same age range, right? there's something else happening on top at that part of the brain. So there are some other processes that increase the concentration of these chemicals. So then what we did, we took the LSBQ composite score, and then we saw whether bilingual experience correlated with these concentrations, and actually it did. And it did in the expected directions. So we had another indication that these pruning mechanisms take place in the bilingual brain, and they're also dependent on the bilingual experience. And then after that, everything looked so fine, right? Is that it? So how we solved the problem? Do we know that, okay, measure bilingual experience, check the brains, you'll find these patterns, let's move on. I wish it was that easy. We want to delve deeper into this, and we want to look at the type of experience that the bilinguals have. So yeah, I know we talked about categories, which we didn't like, and we went down the quantified route, but then you can quantify within categories. And that's what we did here. So we compared interpreters, translators, and non-professional bilinguals, so regular, let's say, right, standard, boring bilinguals, like the rest of us, that were not immersed. And we ran, with Michal, we ran pretty much the same analysis in these three groups separately. So what you see in these three graphs is, again, always the LSBQ score of the bilinguals composite score in the x-axis, and the volume of coded in the y-axis. But there are three different groups. So for the non-professional bilinguals, you see this increase, which is not really followed by decrease, possibly reflecting that these are not immersed. In the translators and the interpreters, you find this non-linear pattern. This very nice non-linear pattern. This is interesting because the measure is always the same, right? In terms of years, they all have the same experience. But it's not just it's not just years. But anyway, the composite score, the tool that we have, gives them the same score, but then their experience differs. And that is reflected in those patterns, right? So regular bilinguals are not comparable to interpreters or translators. Even more interestingly, when we look at the putamen, which is another subcortical structure which is key for articulatory control in general, or in particular, not in general, we found an increase in bilinguals, in volume, in bilinguals and in translators with increased experience, right? So the more experienced you are, the bigger the putamen. But for the interpreters, this is where we started seeing this non-linear pattern. And this is probably because the interpreters are the ones who actually have to articulate, whereas the translators don't necessarily have to articulate when they translate something, right? So these are professional interpreters. So it looks like this experience of interpreting taxes the putamen more only for the interpreters, but not for the other groups. So again, whether we use this questionnaire, this composite score, well, it's good, but it might not give us the full story, right? We need to understand the actual experiences of our participants. And we didn't stop there because we are crazy with this. We wanted to see the effects of code switching on the brain, because we know that code switching encompasses cognitive costs. And these cognitive costs are not always the same. So they relate to the directionality of cognitive switching. So we know that switching from L1 to L2 is less costly than switching from L2 to L1. And also, the types of switching might matter as well, because we have different types of switching. You can have alternation, when you just stop in one language and continue in the other language. You can have insertion of words of language B when you speak in language A, or you can have dense code switching, where you change between words without thinking a lot about it. And this is a continuum of inhibitory control. So we know that for cases like alteration code switching, this is really, really costly for the system. This is the most difficult task. Whereas when you do dense code switching, when you speak Staglica and then suddenly petas lex stylinka without really thinking about it, that's not the most costly of those processes. And we want to see whether this cost would be reflected in brain adaptations as well, right? So as I said, delving deeper into the experience, the everyday experiences of our bilinguals. So this paper is still in submission. And again, that was checking these bilinguals, non-immersed ones, and we gave them a code switch frequency judgment task. So we pretty much asked them for each type of code switching to say how often they would encounter this or use it in everyday life. So that's all self-reported, right? Self-reported frequencies. So these are the different types of code switching. So the first was intersentential, so between sentences, really, followed by the other three that we saw: alteration, insertion, dense code switching. And these are provided here in order of cognitive cost, let's say, in order of difficulty to the system. So, and also we asked separately the frequency of all these types of code switching from for switching from L1 to L2, but also from L2 to L1, the very costly way. So we find that frequency of code switching affects the volume of the coded across the board, no matter what type of switching you do. Again, this tells us that coded is important for switching anyway. But then for the most costly types of switching, we also found the thalamus being affected. So the thalamus is known to kick in when you have all these very, very challenging tasks. And then we have this nice non-linear effect, which I don't know how to interpret yet, but that's not a problem now. For the costly type, the L2 to L1, again, we find the effects of on the coded. Some of them become non-linear now, and now we have more effects on the thalamus. So it looks like the thalamus is affected when you have the most demanding code switching type. So probably supports the coded nucleus one way or the other to do this task. I don't know what that means. But again, the bottom line is we need to take into account all these experiences as well. It's not just what the questionnaires tell us. So that's one of the things that we need to take into account as we move forward. So I've started discussing the what next now. I wanted to turn to function now, and I wanted to hand over to Alex, who will talk to us about some very exciting findings that we have to present.
Okay, thank you, Christos. If you could just flick the slide, thank you. Okay, so in terms of the current findings on bilingualism and brain function, what we already know is that with increased bilingual experience, we see increased reliance on posterior and subcortical parts of the brain. And this is the opposite of the posterior to anterior shift, which is typically observed as people age. And this essentially represents greater recruitment of the available resources in the brain compared to monolinguals. But functional adaptations haven't been as comprehensively studied as structural adaptations, which means that we don't have much or any evidence on potential nonlinear patterns, as we've previously found in structural measures, as well as how these shifts in brain function are affected by cognitive context. As you'll all be aware, the brain never shuts down, it constantly adjusts itself to deal with the demands of the context it finds itself in, and we don't yet know quite exactly how bilingual experience affects those changes. So what we did is we measured brain connectivity using EEG, both at rest and following 3 separate cognitive tasks, each of which was in a different cognitive domain. So we administered a task in the language domain, which was a picture name retrieval task, one in the attentional or executive function domain, which is your standard flanker task. And then we also administered a domain general task, which was an artificial grammar learning task. Okay. And that artificial grammar learning task is the one I'm going to be focusing on today. And for all of these, we measure bilingual experience using the LSBQ composite score, just as Mikhail did for his subcortical structural analysis. So this is the connectivity pattern that we observed pre-task. The way we modeled this is we use generalized additive models with LSBQ composite score modeled against the strength of connectivity using the connectors you see on there have an arrow on the end indicating the flow of information. And so we see that multiple regions across the brain, their connectivity strength is modulated by bilingual experience. We see some long distance occipital frontal connections. We also see some central occipital connections, and we see a combination of inter and intrahemispheric connections, all modulated by bilingual experience level. In the pre-task condition, we saw effects in both hemispheres. All of the effects are nonlinear, and the peaks in connectivity occur at mid or high levels of bilingual experience, which tells us that depending on your level of experience, you tend to recruit these regions of the brain more strongly, either when you've gained experience and you're progressing to the peak efficiency stage, if we're looking back to the DRM, or you experience these increases in connectivity as you reach that sort of higher experience level that you can. So post-task, the orange arrows on the head diagram there are the connections which are modulated by bilingual experience. And just on the left there, I've got a little bit more detail on the task because I know artificial grammar learning is a little bit ambiguous. So the task we used was a binary serial reaction time AGL task. And we used a class of grammars called Lindenmayer system grammars. We used the simplest one, which is known as the Fibonacci grammar, because it follows the Fibonacci sequence in a lot of its structure. And the cognitive demands of this task, which make it so domain general, are implicit statistical learning and hierarchical structure processing. And both of these are necessary for a multitude of other different cognitive abilities. And so we consider it to be truly domain general. And the idea of the task is that as participants are exposed to the stimuli sequentially, they implicitly learn the statistical regularities between the stimuli in order to predict which item's coming next, which is then shown in reduced reaction times as they progress throughout the task. And you can see that just in the little diagram down at the bottom there. And the patterns we see post-task essentially shift from both hemispheres to almost exclusively left hemisphere connections. We also see an increased number of left central outbound connections, and we see that the direction of information flow has now shifted to be entirely posteriorly directed when there are strong cognitive task demands. Okay, so what this study has told us is that bilingualism has quite a large impact on how connectivity adapts in the short term, so over the course of minutes, in response to specific cognitive demands involving a shift in the hemispheres which are recruited. So we see right hemisphere connections pre-task versus only left hemisphere connections post-task. We see varying direction of information flow, shifting from a combination to only posteriorly directed connections, which does suggest some greater reliance on posterior regions for cognitively demanding processes in bilinguals, but not necessarily at rest. And we also saw post-task that the left hemisphere central region seems to act as a task-relevant hub for this domain general task, and this is in keeping with previous fMRI evidence on artificial grammar learning and hierarchical structure tasks, which show that the left prefrontal cortex is an essential area to complete this. And this area also contains overlapping nodes of the language and cognitive control networks, which are taxed by multiple language use. And so it does make sense that this would experience stronger adaptation than other regions. And we also believe that this reflects some greater neural efficiency, which could be related to structural adaptations inherent to bilingual experience. And this is shown by the greater flexibility of connectivity post-task, shown by the increased number of bilingualism modulated connections compared to pre-task, which allows bilinguals to distribute their computational power across more wide-reaching left hemisphere regions as bilingual experience increases, particularly with reference to posterior regions, which does lessen the load on the highly taxed prefrontal areas and likely results in lower neural energy consumption. But to confirm this, we'd want to do some further investigations into neural efficiency and energy flow with larger sample sizes. But this is the direction which we believe that these results point towards.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Don't go. You have more? Right, okay. So, in case you've been wondering about something, I'm here to address this something. And that's what everything has been wondering about when we present this work. The elephant in the room, which is linguistic distance. And this is, as I said, this is a question that we've been receiving in conference for the past 5 to 10 years. And I know that a lot of people in different labs, including here actually, have started thinking about how to tackle this problem. Because the evidence that we have and the theories, my theory, or even the BAPS theory that Alex talked about, or even Vince's framework, we don't really talk about linguistic distance. So how different the languages that the bilinguals speak are to each other, and how this difference might affect these neurocognitive outcomes. Because at the end of the day, this is all about cognitive cost. So if juggling a language pair or a certain language pair is easier than juggling a different language pair, you shouldn't expect the same outcomes in both these groups. And when it comes to that, there are some review papers out, some investigations that have shown very clearly that the evidence of the effects of linguistic distance on brain outcomes, it's very mixed and very inconclusive. And well, there are many reasons for that. So obviously, different groups, different language pairs spoken by these groups, different backgrounds, all these things. But also there's a variety of definitions of linguistic distance across all these studies. So some people look at genealogical distance, some chronological, some lexical, some combination of those distances. So it's pretty messy as well. And obviously this reduces comparability between different studies because different people measure different things, right? So we had a conversation with my colleague, Marco Tamburelli from Bangor, on this, who is on this call. So any question you have, directed to Marco. I'm not the linguist in the room. And we came up with a pre-registered protocol that you can access. And the idea is to operationalize linguistic distance by looking at a variety of different metrics and eventually look at how they may affect or predict these cognitive outcomes. So what we are planning on doing is, first of all, conduct a systematic review of different linguistic distance metrics, as I said, genealogical, typological, you name it, but also whether these are discrete, so whether they split this in categories or whether they are continuous, and then produce the linguistic distance rankings for the most frequently spoken L2s in the UK, based on several sources, and then use all this information to create a composite linguistic distance score using data-driven approaches, which is the most ambitious part of this. We haven't started doing it, but the idea is that we look at things like phonemic distance, so phonemic inventories, compare inventories of these languages to English, parametric typology, lexicophonetic distance like Leverstein distance, and also morphosyntax. So all these are parametric measures, and according to Marco, at least, these are very commonly used in the field. So we want to create these rankings for the language best spoken in the UK across all these metrics. And then, as I said, conduct an exploratory factor analysis to identify clusters among those distance metrics, and then use these classes to create a composite score. And then be able to say that the distance of French to English based on this score is 7, right? And then of Greek to English is 10. So we create a scale, right? We want to create a scale. And then this can be used in future studies conducted in the UK context, obviously, because this will be created in the UK context, but also can be used retrospectively in existing data. Because even in studies like mine, where we have a mixture of L1s and L2 English, we know what the L1s are. Now, if we have this scale, we can add a value of a linguistic distance to each of our participants. And then hopefully this approach can be adopted for other contexts and with other reference languages in the future. So this is very preliminary. We have pre-registered the method. We are open to discussions about this. And as I said, don't kill the psychologist here, kill the linguist. But we can discuss that later on. And coming to the last part of this talk, that's the other question I normally get at conferences. Why do we care about all this? Which is honest, right? It may sound rude, that is honest. And we care because of aging. We know that as we age, brain volume, connectivity, and behavior, and our behavior decline as we age, right? So that's well known. But we also know that these processes vary between individuals, and then there are mechanisms that have been proposed to explain this variability. So some people build what we call brain reserve, a long-term build-up of neural tissue. That may ring a bell. We've been talking about something like that. And also cognitive reserve, preserve cognitive ability in the face of neural loss. So both of these mechanisms, I mean, it's a bit controversial how they are defined. Everything's controversial, obviously. But both of these mechanisms are linked to enriching lifestyle, cognitively enriching lifestyle factors. Education is the most prominent one and the most robust one. But other things like exercise and diet have been shown to promote, to help these mechanisms. So what about bilingualism? Don't forget, especially if you're immersed in a context like this, you are forced to switch between languages, right? It's not an option. So it's a long-term cognitive challenge. So what about aging? Alex will come back to present some newer data, which I don't understand yet because I haven't read the paper, on the healthy aging brain. That's structural data.
Thank you again, Christos. Initially, I started reading more about structural complexity in the bilingual brain. And this is because brain tissue shows self-similarity in its structure at all levels of investigation. So right down from dendritic branching during development to the gyrification of the grey matter, and right up to functional scans showing self-similarity in brain signals during cognitive tasks and at rest. And you can measure this level of self-similarity using a metric called fractal dimension, which is essentially an index of topological complexity and self-similarity. And what we know from the previous literature is that fractal dimension decreases with aging, and it can also be used to help to predict and diagnose neurodegenerative disease and is linked to cognitive decline as well. So essentially, as people's fractal dimension decreases with age, as does their cognitive ability, in the same way that grey matter volume, for example, has been linked to cognitive ability. But even further than that, an increase in fractal dimension has also been linked to greater cognitive ability or expertise. So individuals with greater pitch identification ability were observed to have greater fractal dimension in left hemisphere frontotemporal areas associated with pitch processing. And in a separate study, they found that higher fractal dimension correlated with greater mathematical abilities in typically developing children. So what this says is essentially that structural complexity in the brain represents a greater ability to engage in complex cognitive processes. And so we had the thought that if bilingual experience affects grey and white matter structure measured in other ways, all of these features which we previously measured will also affect a measurement of structural complexity. And as neuroadaptation, as we know it's experienced by bilinguals, is essentially the opposite of neurodegeneration, is strengthening the communication of the brain, it's increasing the size of the grey matter. In a lot of ways, it's the opposite process of the decline that we see with age and with neurodegeneration. And for that reason, fractal dimension should, in theory, work as a metric in both directions. So what I did was I took some of the data from Vince, Tom's, and Mikhal's PhD studies, put them all together into a single data set. So the sample size for this was 205 to 208 participants, because I removed the outliers dynamically only when they outlied in a specific region where they removed from the modeling of that region. And what we found was that bilingualism does indeed protect against decline in fractal dimension in both grey matter and white matter, but there are some differences between whether it's cerebral grey and white matter or cerebellar grey and white matter. So what we found was that left hemisphere cerebral grey matter shows an ever so slight protection against decline in fractal dimension. And we also saw a larger protection against decline in global cerebellar grey matter. But what we saw in the right hemisphere of the cerebral grey matter was in fact the opposite. So bilinguals with higher experience at older ages showed lower fractal dimension than less experienced bilinguals of the same age. But the patterns in the white matter are distinctly different from the grey matter. You can see on the left there we have the grey matter graphs, and these are again similar types of 3D plots to ones you've seen previously, where we have age on the left bottom axis and LSBQ composite score on the lower right axis. And in the white matter, we see that the the relationships are more non-linear than for the grey matter. And we also see that it has a protective effect in both global cerebral and cerebellar white matter, but the effect is smaller in the cerebellum than in the cerebral cortex. And can we just move to the next slide, please, Christos? Thank you. So what these results tell us is that bilingual experience does indeed interact with age to affect the structural complexity of grey and white matter in the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It shows some protective effects at the global level, and white matter shows more nonlinear patterns than grey matter, involving later points of decline in complexity with age. And this is consistent with the slower maturation of white matter compared to that of grey matter. And also, as Christos notes in his dynamic restructuring model, white matter adaptations in bilinguals come later into experience than grey matter adaptations. So this does seem consistent with the previous literature. And what we can also gather is that there doesn't appear to be a protective effect of bilingualism against complexity decline in the right hemisphere grey matter, which I believe could be indicative of left hemisphere dominant grey matter adaptations in the bilingual brain. Obviously, there's overlapping language and control network regions in the left hemisphere. The language network is typically left lateralized for the majority of people. So again, this makes sense with the previous literature. But this was just an initial investigation into the utility of this metric to measure both decline and adaptation essentially in the same data set. So now that we know that there are global effects of bilingualism on these measures of topological complexity, we can take a more targeted approach. So in the future, I'm planning to analyze the different lobes of the cerebrum using fractal dimension as well to see if there's any particular effects in a particular region. And then following on from that and informed by its conclusions, I'm planning to do a region of interest-based analysis on a new MRI data sample, essentially picking out much smaller regions, more targeted regions, informed by the findings of the previous analysis, and also what we know to be the nodes of overlapping functional networks, which are affected by bilingual experience. And then even further in the future, if it's possible or feasible, I would like to try this type of analysis on a data set including people with MCI, frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or even susceptibility to developing Alzheimer's due to their genotype, essentially to see if there is a difference between healthy aging and neurodegeneration when it comes to cortical complexity and bilingualism interacting with age. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And we may have an MCI data set for you to look at. We'll tell you about. So, excellent. And that's a nice segue to the next and the last portion of this talk, and it's about the declining brain. So yeah, Alex talked about how we could look at the Alzheimer's disease brains and MCI brains, and we have some evidence, increased evidence that there are bilingualism-induced brain reserves in patients with MCI and Alzheimer's disease. But again, the evidence remains inconsistent because of methodology issues, description of the samples, of bilingual experience, so on and so forth, right? The usual problems they have, even with healthy participants. So we were wondering whether, okay, there is some evidence inconsistent, right? So at some point, we wondered with Thompson and Jason whether bilingualism could be a more generalized protective factor in progressive neurodegeneration. So we reviewed the literature for evidence on the effects of bilingualism, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and Huntington's disease. Very small literature. It was less than 10 papers across all diseases, actually. And again, simply, when you're dealing with such a small number of papers, great amount of inconsistencies or different approaches. There were some promising findings there, but I've always had it in mind to follow up on this. And the problem you have with these diseases is it's not very easy to recruit patients, let alone bilingual patients that you measure the bilingual experience, right? Also, many of the existing studies used tasks tapping language skills, but not domain general cognition skills, so not the things we've been looking at. And those bilingual samples, simply because they're so difficult to get, they won't be optimistic when it comes to the language experiences, if the language experiences have been measured at all. Some of these issues also apply to studies of Alzheimer's disease, but as I said, the evidence is a little bigger for this. It's a bit more. Plus, there's another big oversight in the literature. Are there risk factors that need to be accounted for in investigations looking at cognitive reserves in older age? And there are many of those. But in this case, we looked at the recent Lancet report on dementia prevention. And this report gets published every so often, every year, every 2 years. It was disappointing that the last version didn't include bilingualism, but hopefully next time we will convince the people. I don't know. But these are all the things you need to take into account. So diabetes, cholesterol, smoking, obesity, so general health. But also things like physical activity, continuous cognitive activity, hearing loss, visual loss, all these things may contribute to cognitive reserves, which means they may interfere with the effects that we are observing in bilinguals, at least in healthy bilinguals, let alone patient populations. So we wanted to find a way to account for everything and then show the way of how to do things in the future. So that sounds truly ambitious from our part, but we have a suggestion for this, right? So if you wanted to look at Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Huntington's, there are many challenges you're faced with. So the samples will always be rare. The bilingual experiences will always be very disparate. They won't be comparable, right? And you will need to measure them somehow. There are many confounding factors to account for, including those that we looked from the Lancet report, but also there aren't appropriate tools that are applicable to many contexts, right? So you are bound by the tools that you use as well. And I'm talking about tools that are not in languages other than English. The majority of them are just in English. So with Marco Antoniou, Marco Calabria, and Ionandoni Dugnaveitia, we decided that the protocol is needed to be the basis for more systematic research, but in the long run. So this is not a study I could run in my lab or Marco could run in his lab. This is just the beginning of multi-lab collaborations in the long run in order to access as large samples as possible. And this will require tools that can be translated, normed in multiple languages. So that's a protocol that we published earlier this year, which we call the multi-DGen protocol. And we'll start using it in future grant applications in different labs across the world when we find the collaborators. That's an open call for collaborations here as well, by the way, right? And people online. So this is what the protocol looks like. Well, that's where you can find the protocol in methods X. And this is what it looks like. So we have three main sections of our testing. So the background information that we collect, I'll get into details in a second, lasts for over an hour. It can all be done online. There's a cognition section as well, about 100 minutes, can all be run online. And also we have the neuroimaging component. We propose an MRI protocol, but we understand that not everybody has access to MRI or resources to do MRI. We also propose an FNIRS protocol, which is much cheaper to run. But again, you could even collect data on the cognitive battery only from these diseases, from patients with these diseases. This will still be very valuable. So the patients we will want to recruit will be diagnosed with these diseases based on established criteria. I won't go into these details here. The background information we will collect, of course, the language history background with the LHQ3 questionnaire, simply because it produces, again, a multilingual language diversity score, but also it's there to be used, and it's already translated to 43 languages. So there's a wide reach. Then we will use the Cognitive Reserves Index Questionnaire, or CRIC. Some of you may be familiar with it. And then it includes subscores for education, working activity, leisure time activities, blah, 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 blah. At the moment, it's available in 16 languages, but then it can be normed in other languages quite readily, I believe. We will include questions about all these things that were listed in the Lancet report: alcohol consumption, smoking habits, physical activity, BMI, vision, medication, so on and so forth. The diet. Diet is a very interesting thing to account for, because when I ask experts about how do you include diet in a protocol that you want to be compatible across different cultural contexts, they said, forget about it. It's very, very difficult. So we will go with the minimum we can do. So number of fruit and vegetable portions consumed per day or something like that. And then we'll add measures of quality of life and mental health, which also seem to have an effect on cognitive reserve. It's great. When it comes to a cognitive battery, we'll start with the MOCA. You should all be familiar with this. It's just a screening for cognitive decline, and available in 93 languages at the moment, could be made available in more. And then a set of non-verbal, culturally neutral tasks, tapping reasoning skills, visual spatial abilities, processing speed, and executive functions. Then language tasks that are readily adaptable to different languages, like verbal fluency tasks, working memory. Semantic memory task, where we'll show them 30 images for the multi-pick data set. And then this will be followed by episodic memory task, when we will mix this initial 30 images with another 30 images, and there will be just an old new task. If you're not familiar with multi-pick, this is another project we've been pursuing with Jon Andoni for the past 11 years now. So this is a big data set comprising 500 colored line drawings of several concepts, of common concepts. And then we collect naming norms and familiarity measures in different languages. So multi-pick is available in 35 languages or language varieties at the moment. We have another, how many are they? 15, 20 in the works now. So this will expand massively. One of the authors is in the room, Sasha, who's doing the Ukrainian version of multi-pick. So that's almost done, I believe, right? But if there's a language you're interested in and you don't see it here, let us know, because this is an open-ended project. I'll be doing that until I retire, I have decided. But it's nice. Finally, the neuroimaging protocol, the MRI part will have sequences looking at gray matter volume, white matter structure, white matter lesions or hyperintensities, as we call them, and resting state fMRI. And the FNERS protocol, we just look at brain function, cannot look at structure. FNERS is mobile, it's cheaper, it can go to hospital, so it has some benefits, not as precise as fMRI, but we have to be a bit flexible with that. We're almost done. The analysis will be within patient groups. And then if we have good samples, we may decide to do between groups comparisons, also maybe collect some control data. We will use GAMS as well to look at the effects that we've been finding in the past, with main predictor being the multilingual language diversity score, as we get it from the LHQ, and then everything else will be background measures or covariates. And then we'll look how the MLD will predict behavioral performance, function, structural connectivity, and volume in the brain. So a comprehensive approach as much as we can. And as I said, if you're interested in start working on grants to use this protocol, please be in touch, because that's what I want to do from now on. This I'm going to focus on getting this done as I can. And that's it, really. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you in Reading in June, because we have a conference that may be of interest.
He says if you stop sharing, you